2020 felt like the end of the world as we knew it. Streets were empty, hospitals were full, and the global economy was teetering on the edge of an abyss. To prevent a total collapse, the government opened the floodgates of the Treasury. Billions in Paycheck Protection Program funds and economic injury disaster loans were authorized in days. It was a lifeline meant for the small business owners and family clinics that were the heartbeat of the nation. But where there is desperate need, there are always vultures. The speed of the distribution meant traditional safeguards were bypassed. It was a digital gold rush, a lawless frontier where the prize was taxpayer money. Agent Elias Thorne sat in his dim office at the Department of Justice, the blue light of his monitors reflecting in his weary eyes. A veteran financial investigator, Elias was driven by a quiet, stubborn sense of duty. He remembered his father, a man who worked 40 years in a factory and treated tax returns with reverence. To Elias, every dollar stolen wasn't just a number. It was a betrayal of every citizen who played by the rules. He knew a new breed of criminal was feasting on the chaos. Deep within the dark web, a figure known as the architect was turning theft into an art form. He didn't rob banks with masks. He robbed the country with keystrokes and algorithms. The architect was a digital mastermind who identified every loophole in the government's relief systems. He hosted secret seminars, teaching disciples how to create shell companies and exploit the lack of oversight. To him, the government was a malfunctioning ATM, and he had the master key, which he watched as billions were siphoned into untraceable accounts, laughing at the simplicity of the heist. Miles away, the consequences were real. Sarah, owner of a small medical clinic, sat at her desk with her head in her hands. She had spent a decade building her practice to provide care to a community that had little. When lockdowns hit, she applied for the relief funds needed to keep her nurses employed. But the notification she received was a punch to the gut. Her application was denied. The system claimed she had already received a loan. Someone had stolen her business's identity and walked away with the precious money meant to save her life's work. She was a ghost in her own country, her plea for help blocked by a shadow. This theft did not go unnoticed. As the scale of fraud became apparent, the Department of Justice realized they were fighting a systemic assault on trust. In response, they formed the National Fraud Enforcement Task Force, or the NFED. Elias Thorne was among the first called to lead this specialized unit of investigators. The mission was clear: hunt down the vultures and recover every stolen cent. Before we continue this journey into the heart of the investigation, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Elias began connecting the dots to find the source. He wasn't looking for the hands, he was looking for the brain. Weeks of meticulous data scraping finally paid off. The scale was staggering, reaching hundreds of billions in taxpayer losses. It was a threat that could erode the public's faith in justice forever. It gets while analyzing fraudulent applications from a major banking system, he spotted a recurring anomaly in the metadata. It was a digital fingerprint buried deep in the code. It was the architect's signature. This was a direct path into the heart of the conspiracy. Elias felt a surge of adrenaline as the trail led him toward a metropolitan banking hub. The man who thought he was invisible had finally left a mark. The hunt had officially begun, and Elias would not stop until the architect was in chains. He stared at the screen, knowing this was only the first fracture in a much larger wall. Vultures were out of time. The glowing map in the NFED's command center looked like a nervous system under fire, with red pulses tracing the movement of stolen wealth. Elias Thorne stood at the center of this digital storm, his eyes tracking the flow of taxpayer dollars as they cascaded through a labyrinth of shell companies. These weren't just random accounts. They were a complex architecture of deceit. From Delaware to the Cayman Islands, the money moved with a speed that traditional laws could not catch. Elias and his team of elite analysts utilized cutting-edge data analytics, watching as billions meant for struggling families were converted into digital assets. Each click of the mouse revealed a new layer of the architect's empire, a sprawling network of ghost corporations that existed only to swallow the nation's generosity. While Elias fought through the data, the human cost of the theft grew more dire. In her quiet clinic, Sarah looked at the final notice, taped to her front door. The waiting room was now haunted by the sound of packing tape. She had spent every cent of her savings trying to cover the payroll that the stolen relief funds should have handled. Elias saw Sarah's face every time he closed his eyes. The weight of her struggle fueled his obsession, driving him to work through the night until the lines between his life and the case blurred into a single mission. He wasn't just chasing numbers. He was fighting for the survival of a community's heart. The breakthrough they needed came with the bitter sting of betrayal. Among the millions of lines of code, the team discovered a pattern of internal security breaches. A mid-level government employee had been corrupted. For a fraction of the stolen millions, he had been selling administrative access codes to the architect, providing the digital keys to the Treasury's back door. And this revelation sent shockwaves through the NFED. The predator wasn't just at the gates. He had a key to the house. Elias felt a cold fury as he realized how deep the rot had spread. This was an inside job that threatened the very integrity of the government's relief efforts. A high-stakes shadow war erupted across the global financial network. As the NFED began freezing accounts in real time, the architect fought back with surgical precision. It became a frantic game of cat and mouse played in the blink of an eye. The fraudsters used cryptocurrency mixers to turn dirty dollars into untraceable tokens. Elias watched the screens as the architect's network scrambled to move the money faster than the DOJ could lock it down. The tension in the room was suffocating. A day every second, representing another $1 million that could vanish forever into the void of the blockchain. Sensing the walls closing in, the architect began a scorched earth campaign. He started deleting massive server files, wiping the digital paper trail that Elias had spent months constructing. The evidence was disappearing in front of their eyes. Just as the darkness seemed to be winning, Elias spotted a massive transaction in progress. $50 million was being funneled into a private cold wallet, a destination where the law could never follow. With his heart hammering, Elias executed an emergency override. He managed to sever the connection just seconds before the transfer finalized. The room erupted in a brief cheer, but Elias knew the victory was fragile. The architect's arrogance provided the opening the DOJ needed, and despite his digital genius, he had a physical weakness for the spoils of his crime. A single human error surfaced, a physical delivery address for a luxury item purchased with stolen funds. This wasn't a digital ghost. It was a real-world location in a high-end penthouse. The digital shadow had finally taken a physical form. The NFED immediately mobilized, coordinating for a simultaneous multi-state raid. However, just as the strike teams moved into position, Elias received a frantic tip. The architect had detected the breach and was not waiting for dawn. He had a private jet fueled and waiting on a secluded tarmac, scheduled to depart in less than 3 hours. The window was closing fast, and the predator was preparing to escape the reach of justice. And the tires of the tactical vehicles screeched against the pavement as the NFED strike team descended upon the high-end penthouse. There was no time for subtlety. The clock was ticking down to the moment the architect's private jet would leave the tarmac. Elias Thorne was the first through the door. They found the architect sitting by a floor-to-ceiling window, a glass of vintage wine in his hand as he watched the city lights. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a businessman who had found a more profitable line of work. He didn't reach for a weapon or try to run. Instead, he offered a cold, practiced smile. He told Elias that he had merely played the game the government had set up, exploiting the cracks that were already there. To him, the billions were merely a high score in a digital simulation. And the arrogance of that statement hung heavy during the interrogation at the DOJ headquarters. The architect sat under the harsh glow of clinical lights, his composure seemingly unshakable. Elias didn't start with bank accounts or server logs. He opened a folder and placed a single photograph on the table. Sarah's clinic, its doors locked, and a for lease sign hanging from the window. He spoke about the people in that small town who had lost their health care, the employees who couldn't pay rent, and the crushing weight of a stolen identity. Elias watched as the architect's eyes flickered, the abstraction of his crimes finally meeting the raw reality of the damage he had caused. The silence in the room stretched until it became unbearable. To avoid a lifetime in maximum security, the mastermind's pride finally broke. He began to talk, he providing decryption keys and the names of the internal moles and international accomplices that had fueled his empire. This confession signaled the official launch of what the Department of Justice called the New War. Using the architect's own data, the NFED triggered a massive wave of thousands of indictments across the country. The visual of the recovery was staggering. In a display of federal power, agents were seen on news broadcasts seizing fleets of Ferraris from suburban driveways, towing yachts from private docks, and reclaiming sprawling mansions bought with the blood of taxpayers. These weren't just trophies. They were the physical manifestation of a stolen future being clawed back. The Treasury began the complex process of liquidating these assets to return every cent to the programs that had been gutted by greed. Because in her small-town clinic, Sarah was packing the last of her medical supplies when her phone vibrated. A representative from the NFED informed her that her business's identity had been cleared of all fraud. More importantly, her aid application had been approved, and the funds were being deposited within the hour. Sarah sat down on an empty crate, the tears finally coming, not from the stress of loss, but from the overwhelming relief of being seen. Her life's work was saved, and the shadow that had haunted her for months was gone. As the sun began to rise over the Department of Justice building, Elias Thorne stood on the balcony, breathing in the cool morning air. The Wild West era of pandemic fraud, where billions could vanish into the digital ether without a trace, had finally come to an end. and in the war on taxpayer theft was far from over. But the message being sent to the world was absolute. The DOJ leadership released a final warning to the public. They now possessed the data, the technology, and the unwavering patience to hunt down every last vulture. Elias watched the city wake up, feeling justice restored. The people he had sworn to protect were safe, and the era of the architect was nothing more than a closed file in the archives of history.